Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going deep on the myth of American idealism.
By Noam Chomsky and Nathan J. Robinson.
That's right. And we're going to explore how this book challenges some pretty common beliefs about America's role in the world.
It definitely does that. It kind of turns the traditional narrative on its head.
Okay, so let's start with that traditional narrative, the idea of American exceptionalism.
Right. America as this beacon of democracy and freedom, intervening in the world for, purely benevolent reasons, spreading democracy and all that.
Yeah, like that whole Wilsonian idealism thing, good intentions, right?
Yeah, exactly. But Chomsky and Robinson, they argue that the U.S. actually acts a lot like other powerful nations throughout history. Self-interest is the driving force, even if it means bending the rules a bit.
They actually say U.S. foreign policy follows this vile maxim, putting its own interests above everything else.
Right, and they back that up with a ton of historical examples.
So it's not just like they're making these sweeping statements, they're actually getting into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, they go deep, laying out this pattern of U.S. intervention that really clashes with this whole, benevolent superpower image.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me some examples. Let's see what they got.
Well, let's start with Chile in 1973. We have Allende, a democratically elected socialist leader, and he's overthrown in a coup. And, well, the U.S. role in this whole thing, let's just say they weren't exactly sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah, wasn't Allende kind of a controversial figure?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Especially for the U.S. The book actually goes through declassified documents showing that the U.S. was working to undermine Allende basically from the moment he was elected. They imposed what they called an invisible blockade on Chile, basically choking the economy. And get this. After the coup, they openly supported Pinochet's brutal dictatorship.
It's like they were actively trying to make things worse.
Well, the book quotes Henry Kissinger. He basically said the U.S. shouldn't let a country go communist because of, and I'm quoting here, the irresponsibility of its people.
Wow. So it wasn't just about fighting communism. It was about controlling the outcome. Even if it meant, supporting a dictator.
Exactly. And they have a bunch of other examples. Let's jump over to Korea. The 1940s and 50s. After World War II, the U.S. backed a regime in South Korea that was, well, they were responsible for thousands of deaths, including this really brutal massacre on Jeju Island.
Jeju Island. I vaguely remember that.
Yeah.
But the details are fuzzy. What happened there?
It was a horrific crackdown on this peasant revolt, and Chomsky and Robinson argue that the U.S. bears a really, really deep responsibility for this massacre.
So not exactly the actions of a shining beacon of freedom. Okay, any other examples? Maybe something a little less known, something that'll really surprise people?
Oh, they have a few. They bring up British Guiana in the 1960s. This one's interesting. It wasn't tanks and troops. They intervened, but through these really, really sneaky CIA operations and their goal to prevent a socialist, a guy named Chedi Jagan, from winning elections.
Hold on, British Guiana. That's a bit random, isn't it? Why would the U.S. even care about a place like that?
That's exactly the point. This wasn't about, some direct threat to U.S. security. The argument is that the U.S. just couldn't tolerate another leftist government in the hemisphere, right? They were terrified of, a second Cuba.
So again, it's about the U.S. wanting to control things, even in these countries that you wouldn't think would be, that important on the world stage.
Yeah, and it's not just historical curiosity. These interventions, they had long-term consequences. Chomsky and Robinson explain how this led to I'm just going to quote them here, a vicious racist taking power, which triggered this whole period of violence and oppression in British Guiana.
So even when they're, supposedly promoting democracy, it can backfire in a big way.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And then you have Cuba. Oh, this is where it gets interesting. They talk about the U.S.'s long and kind of obsessive hostility towards Cuba. And I mean, some of these CIA plots are just wild. We're talking assassination attempts on Castro that sound like something out of a movie. Exploding cigars, poisoned wetsuits. I mean, you name it.
Exploding cigars. You're kidding, right?
Nope, not kidding. It's almost comical, but obviously it wasn't a laughing matter for Castro. And it wasn't just the assassination attempts. The book details this whole range of covert operations. Bombings, sabotage. They even tried to contaminate Cuban sugar. I mean, it was relentless.
So even with Cuba, right, a country that really posed no military threat to the U.S., they were willing to go to these extreme lengths. It makes you think about Nicaragua in the 80s, right? The Contras and all that. Wasn't that another messy situation?
Oh, absolutely. They talk about that too. The U.S. funding the Contras, who were this pretty brutal rebel group fighting against the Sandinista government. It was another proxy war, and just like so many others, it ended up causing, immense suffering for the people of Nicaragua.
Right. I remember the Contras being in the news, but I don't really remember the specifics. What were they even trying to do? And what was the impact of, the U.S. getting involved?
Well, essentially, the Contras were trying to overthrow the Sandinistas, who, of course, the U.S. saw as this communist threat.
Yeah.
And the book really emphasizes the devastation that this U.S.-backed war caused. Schools and hospitals destroyed, social programs disrupted, thousands of civilians killed. It was bad.
Yeah, it sounds like every time we dig into one of these historical events, it just gets more and more complicated.
Oh, yeah. And it's not just the big-name conflicts either. They talk about the U.S. supporting the Salvadoran military in the 1980s. This military was notorious for human rights abuses. I mean, just terrible stuff. But the U.S. still provided them with, training and funding.
Why? What was the excuse this time?
Well, officially it was about fighting communism, right? Always communism. But the book really highlights how dark it actually was. They talk about the targeted killing of priests, even the idea that just having a Bible could get you labeled as subversive.
Wow. So it wasn't even about fighting communism. It was about crushing any form of dissent. I mean, that's messed up.
Yeah. And they have this quote. They say that it paints a picture of a regime gripped by paranoia, resorting to extreme violence to maintain control. It's pretty chilling.
It's starting to feel like a broken record, right? The U.S. steps in, often making things worse, and there's always this justification. But then you look closer, and it's really about something else entirely.
That's exactly the point they're making. And that's why they argue that this myth of American idealism is so dangerous. It allows the U.S. to get away with things that would be condemned if, any other country did them.
Yeah, I mean, we've barely scratched the surface here, and it's already pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Are there any other historical examples that they go into?
Oh, tons. They go back even further, talking about U.S. involvement in Indonesia in 1965. And this was truly a dark chapter. We're talking about the mass killing of suspected communists, hundreds of thousands of people murdered, and the U.S., well, they played a role in this.
I have to admit, I don't really know much about this at all. What did the U.S. do?
Chomsky and Robinson, they cite evidence that U.S. officials actually gave lists of suspected communists to the Indonesian military, and the military, well, they carried out the killings.
That's pretty disturbing. It's hard to see how you could, square that with any notion of the U.S. promoting democracy or human rights.
Yeah, and it's not an isolated incident. They also talk about the 1953 CIA coup in Iran, where they overthrew Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader, and installed the Shah, who, well, he was a brutal dictator.
Oh, right, the Shah. He was definitely on our side during the Cold War, but he wasn't exactly, a champion of human rights.
No, not at all. And the U.S. supported him for decades, turning a blind eye to all the human rights abuses. Chomsky and Robinson argue that this wasn't just some, mistake or oversight. It was a deliberate choice.
Okay, so yet again, the U.S. is putting its own interests ahead of, democratic principles. I'm sensing a pattern here.
Right. And the pattern continues. They talk about Vietnam, the U.S. involvement there, and they argue that it went way beyond just containing communism. They talk about the devastating impact of the war, the targeting of civilians, the use of Agent Orange.
Yeah, Vietnam. That's such a complex conflict. It seems like there's still so much we don't know about the U.S. role there.
They trace it all the way back to the 1940s, explaining how the U.S. actually opposed Vietnamese independence from France in the beginning. And they argue that throughout the whole Cold War period, the U.S. consistently blocked attempts to bring real democracy to Vietnam, choosing instead to prop up these regimes that would just, do what they wanted.
It's a good reminder that things aren't always as black and white as we like to think. Does the book talk about more recent stuff like, the Gulf War?
Yeah.
The Iraq War?
Oh, they go there. They discuss the Gulf War in the 90s and the sanctions that followed, which, caused a lot of suffering for Iraqi civilians. And then, of course, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They argue that it was based on false pretenses and that the consequences, well, they were disastrous.
Yeah. 2003, still a hot topic. What's their take on it?
Well, they highlight that there was no real justification for the war. Iraq posed no threat to the U.S. at the time. And then, of course, there's the human cost. The deaths, the displacement, the rise of ISIS, all of that. And they argue that a lot of that was a direct result of, the U.S. invasion.
So they're saying it was a big mistake driven by self-interest and bad ideology, not any real concern for the Iraqi people.
That's their argument. And they also point out that there was never really any accountability for those who, were responsible for the war, the people who made the decisions. They kind of got away with it.
Ugh. It's like we never learn, do we? Keep making the same mistakes. This is a lot to process. Does the book offer any hope? Any solutions? Or is it just all doom and gloom?
Well, they do offer some hope. They argue that change is possible, but it requires, a pretty fundamental shift in thinking. We need to be more critical, more informed, more engaged. We need to understand the real nature of, U.S. power and how it operates in the world. And then we can start to push for a better foreign policy.
I like that. It's not about, hating America. It's about wanting it to be better.
Exactly.
We've only scratched the surface here, and I've got so many more questions.
Yeah.
What about the dangers of this idealism? How does the media play into all of this?
Well, that's where we're headed next. We'll dive into how this whole belief in American exceptionalism can be used to justify, some pretty questionable actions. And we'll look at how the media helps to shape public opinion, often in ways that prevent any real dissent.
Okay. That sounds like another fascinating conversation. Let's get into it.
It's one thing to look at these, specific events, but Chomsky and Robinson, they kind of take it a step further. They argue that there's a deeper issue here, what they call the dangers of idealism.
Okay, so now we're getting to the heart of it. I can already see how believing that America is always the good guy, could lead to some pretty bad decisions. But how do they actually lay this out in the book?
They argue that this myth of American idealism basically acts like a shield, right? A moral shield. It allows the U.S. to kind of avoid taking responsibility for its actions, both at home and abroad.
So it's like a get-out-of-jail-free card. We meant well, so you can't criticize us too harshly.
Exactly. It's this idea that our intentions were pure, so the consequences don't really matter. And that can be a really dangerous way of thinking.
Yeah, because if you believe you're always the good guy, you'd never have to, question your own motives. You never have to think about the long-term consequences.
Right. You become blind to your own flaws. And this is where Chomsky and Robinson connect the myth of American idealism to the role of the media. They argue that the media often plays a key role in perpetuating this myth.
Okay, that makes sense. We all get our information from somewhere, and if the main narrative is always painting the U.S. in this positive light, it's hard to see things any other way.
Exactly. And they point out that even when the media does criticize, specific wars or interventions, like let's say Afghanistan, they often focus on things like, tactical failures, strategic blunders, but they rarely question whether the intervention itself was even justified in the first place.
So it's like, okay, maybe we messed up the execution, but our hearts were in the right place. But they're still not really addressing the bigger issue.
Exactly. It leads to what they call noble mistake theory, right? Which is this idea that we can downplay the harm that's been done because, we meant well.
Noble mistake theory. That's a good one. It's much easier to admit to making mistakes than to admit that maybe, you were actually acting immorally.
Right. And Chomsky and Robinson, they argue that this whole tendency to frame everything as a noble mistake, it prevents us from having these honest conversations about U.S. foreign policy. It prevents us from holding our leaders accountable.
It's all starting to sound very Orwellian. Are they suggesting that there's some kind of, deliberate manipulation going on?
They don't rule it out. They bring up the concept of manufacture of consent.
Manufacture of consent. Okay, that's a term that definitely makes you think.
It's a term that was actually coined by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky back in the 80s.
Ah, okay. So Chomsky's been on this for a while.
Yeah, he has. And the basic idea behind manufacture of consent is that the media can be used to, shape public opinion, to kind of set the limits of acceptable debate. It's not always about outright censorship. It can be a lot more subtle than that.
It's about framing the conversation, right? Choosing what gets covered and how it gets presented.
Exactly. And they argue that this manufacture of consent is a big part of how the myth of American idealism is maintained.
So it's not just about protecting America's image, it's about protecting the system itself.
Right. And Chomsky and Robinson, they argue that this has real-world consequences. It allows these harmful interventions to continue.
So it's a bit of a vicious cycle, right? The media helps to perpetuate the myth, which then allows these actions to continue, and the media just keeps reporting on it all as if, everything is normal. What can we even do about it? If the media is so powerful, how do we break free?
That's the big question, isn't it? Chomsky and Robinson, they really stress the importance of critical thinking, seeking out independent media, really becoming more informed citizens.
So it's about being more media literate, understanding how the media works, what the biases are, the agendas.
Exactly. And it's about, being willing to ask tough questions, demand evidence, not just accepting things at face value.
Okay. It's a lot of work, but it also feels kind of empowering.
It is. It's about taking control of your own mind, right?
Yeah.
Not letting yourself be manipulated.
We've talked a lot about the past, but what about the present? Does the book address any current challenges or, what this all means for the future?
They do. They talk about a bunch of stuff, actually, but two big ones are the U.S. relationship with China and then the war in Ukraine.
Okay, let's start with China. That seems to be, it seems like tensions are pretty high right now.
Yeah, for sure. Chomsky and Robinson, they argue that the U.S. increasingly sees China as a threat, right? A threat to their global dominance. And they're responding with this policy of containment, which basically means, strengthening military alliances in the region, imposing sanctions, engaging in this war of words that can sometimes get a little too close for comfort.
It's like we're heading for another Cold War, but this time it's with a country that's actually, a major economic power. Do they offer any insights into how we got to this point?
They argue that it stems from this fundamental clash of worldviews. The U.S. is still clinging to this idea of, a unipolar world where they're in charge, they make the rules, but China is challenging that. They're asserting their own interests. They want a multipolar world.
Okay, so it's not just about, trade wars or military stuff. It's a much bigger conflict about the future.
Exactly. And it has the potential to get really, really messy.
Does the book offer any solutions?
Well, they argue that the U.S. needs to rethink its approach to China. Instead of seeing them as an enemy to be contained, they say we should be trying to build a more cooperative relationship.
That sounds great in theory, but is it realistic? I mean, can the U.S. even see China as anything other than a threat at this point?
That's the challenge, right? They acknowledge that it's a tall order. The U.S. foreign policy establishment, it's very much stuck in this Cold War mindset.
It's going to take more than just, a new president or a new policy. It's a much deeper problem than that.
Right. It's about changing the way we think about the world, about America's role in the world.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Ukraine. Another complex situation. What's their take on that?
Well, Chomsky and Robinson, they argue that the war in Ukraine is a direct result of the U.S. expanding NATO eastward, basically pushing right up against Russia's borders.
So they're placing a lot of the blame on the U.S. for, creating the conditions that led to the war. But isn't Russia still ultimately responsible for the invasion? I mean, they're the ones who attacked.
Oh, they acknowledge that. They're very clear about that.
Yeah.
Russia is responsible for the invasion. But they say we need to understand the historical context, They argue that the U.S. has consistently ignored Russia's security concerns and pursued this aggressive foreign policy that has basically made conflict more likely.
It's definitely a controversial take, but it's a good reminder that there's always more than one side to this story.
Exactly. And there are always, a lot of factors that contribute to these complex situations.
Does the book offer any solutions for, actually resolving the war in Ukraine?
They really emphasize the need for a negotiated settlement, one that addresses, the legitimate security concerns of both Russia and Ukraine. They argue that a military solution is it's not going to happen, and that continuing to, pump weapons into Ukraine is just going to prolong the suffering.
So they're advocating for diplomacy, for finding a compromise, but that seems pretty tough in the current climate.
Yeah, it's not easy. But they argue that it's the only way to actually end the war and prevent a wider conflict.
So we've got nuclear weapons, we've got the climate crisis, we've got rising tensions with China, a war in Europe. It's all pretty overwhelming, honestly.
Yeah.
Does the book offer any reason for hope amidst all this doom and gloom?
They do. They do offer some hope. The key, they say, is education and engagement. We need to be more informed citizens, We need to understand these issues, and we need to demand better from our leaders.
So it's not about giving up, it's about getting involved.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have the power to change things.
So we've been going deep on this book, The Myth of American Idealism. And it's clear that Chomsky and Robinson, they're not pulling any punches, are they? They're arguing that this idealized view of America, it's not just some historical debate. It could actually have serious consequences for the future.
Yeah, they're definitely sounding the alarm. And they highlight a couple of major threats that they see as particularly urgent.
Okay, let's hear it. What are they most worried about?
Nuclear weapons and the climate crisis.
Yeah, those are both pretty big ones. Let's start with nuclear weapons. I mean, everyone agrees they're terrifying, but do they really pose an existential threat? Haven't we been living under this threat of nuclear war for, like, decades now?
That's exactly the danger. Chomsky and Robinson argue that we've become complacent. We've normalized it to the point where we don't really grasp how destructive these weapons are.
It's like we've just gotten used to the idea it's become background noise.
Right, exactly. And they argue that this complacency is incredibly dangerous.
Okay, but haven't we made some progress on, nuclear disarmament? I mean, Cold War is over.
They actually argue that things have gotten worse in recent years. The U.S. has been, modernizing its nuclear arsenal, developing new, more usable weapons, and they've pulled out of some important arms control treaties.
So we're actually going the opposite direction.
It seems that way, and they highlight how absurd the logic is behind all of this. This idea that we can achieve security by building more and more powerful weapons. It just doesn't make sense.
That's like a really dangerous game of chicken, isn't it?
And they also make the point that the American public never really had a say in this whole thing. It wasn't like we voted to develop and maintain this massive nuclear arsenal. It was a top-down decision driven by, a small group of people.
So what's the solution? I mean, what can we do about it?
Well, Chomsky and Robinson advocate for the complete abolition of nuclear weapons. They argue that these weapons are inherently immoral and that their very existence is a threat to humanity.
A world without nuclear weapons. It sounds nice, but is it really possible?
They say it's not only possible, but necessary. And they point to the growing international movement for nuclear disarmament. More and more people are starting to recognize that these weapons are a threat to everyone, not just the countries that possess them.
Okay, well, let's talk about the climate crisis. I mean, every day there are more and more alarming reports about, the impact of climate change. How does this tie into their argument about American idealism?
Well, they argue that the U.S. has played a major role in creating the climate crisis. They highlight the fact that historically, the U.S. has been the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, and they're critical of the U.S. government's failure to take meaningful action to address it.
It's like we're addicted to fossil fuels and we're not willing to change.
Yeah, and they point out the hypocrisy of the U.S. claiming to be a leader on climate change while, still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry.
So what's the solution on the climate front?
They call for a pretty radical transformation of our energy system, moving away from fossil fuels towards, renewables, solar, wind. They argue that this transition is not only necessary to address the climate crisis, but also for creating a more just and sustainable economy.
It's a huge challenge, but it does feel like something we need to do. You need to, reevaluate our relationship with the planet.
Exactly.
Wow, this deep dive has been a lot. Challenging, thought-provoking, but also really important.
I agree, and I think it's clear that Chomsky and Robinson, they've given us a lot to think about.
If there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's don't be afraid to question the stories you're told.
Right.
Seek out different perspectives, challenge the status quo.
Exactly. We have the power to create a better future, but it starts with being informed and engaged.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.
It's